if my memory serves me correctly, I think Luke is the only gospel writer who has a glimpse into the early childhood days of Jesus. Here we have Jesus at age 12, and that is a very significant age in the culture. And so here, of course, we have to realize the proper backdrop and the proper cultural context to interpret what is happening in this gospel between Jesus and Joseph and Mary, and what has happened with the traveling, and how do you lose sight of your child. Which unfortunately happens frequently in our day and age. But nonetheless, Jesus is raised in an agrarian society, so that's the one with animals and farms, etc. So agrarian societies, in Mediterranean agrarian societies at the time, all the boys before the age of puberty and the girls and the women all were together. So there was always a gender division. And so they were raised until puberty with all the women, the boys, until they hit puberty. Then they go to the man's group. So what happens is one of those consequences of the boys being raised with all the women, so mothers, sisters, aunts, everybody, they're all together there. One of the consequences is that the mother develops a very strong bond, very highly influential bond for the boy, especially all the way into adulthood, so all the way into the adulthood of the male. So secondly, since boys were highly valued in this male-dominated culture, they were invariably spoiled and pampered by the women. For instance, a boy is usually breastfed twice as long as the girl, and even long after he is able to speak. So when he asks for food, he's immediately fed, and he concludes that his every word to women is like law. So thirdly then, going along with this understanding of the backdrop of this culture at the time, the culture that Jesus was raised in, since the boy is raised until puberty, to the near complete exclusion of the father or any other male role model, boys enter puberty with an ambiguous identity. So in other words, they don't know how to be a man because they never had that example or role model. So at puberty, the boy is unceremoniously shoved into the man's world. He's shoved out of the comfort of the women's world, and the man's world is harsh and hierarchical. All right, so once you're in the man's world, it's all honor, shame culture. It's you have a certain role, you have to behave a certain way, and this state, once he's pushed out in the men's world, they usually teach this adolescent his proper behavior and place, often by physical punishment or beatings, which he's also taught must be suffered in silence without retaliation. Now, the boy naturally concludes, such stoic suffering is one way of demonstrating manliness. Okay, so that sets the pretext for how the culture anyway. We're not sure exactly how Jesus was raised, but this sets the backdrop, and this gospel passage is likely a good understanding. It's best interpreted against that backdrop, especially when you start to get into how Jesus responds to Joseph and Mary. So we're going to interpret this gospel against that cultural backdrop. So then the question is, of course, then, well, how did they lose Jesus? And why did it take them so long to figure out that he was missing? I mean, a whole day passed by before they figured out he was not with them. Well, you have to understand how they travel. What were their travel habits? Well, people traveled by caravans separately according to gender divisions. So again, all the boys before puberty, all right, and all the girls and all the women and all the mothers and aunts, they travel together in one caravan. Then all the adult males and those males, those young boys who have reached adulthood, they travel together in another caravan. So there's two separate caravans. And they don't get back together until they break for camp at night. All right, so that explains how they could have lost sight of Jesus, because since the adolescent Jesus is 12, okay, he's in the process of transitioning to adulthood. So Joseph, discovering that Jesus is not with him and the other men, he naturally assumed that he was struggling with the transition into adulthood, and he probably went back to the comfort of the women. So that's what Joseph could have assumed. Mary, on the other hand, not finding Jesus in her caravan, would have assumed Jesus has transitioned well into adulthood and that he must be with Joseph and the other men. So that explains how you could lose him. And of course, Jesus didn't get lost. A lot of times we say Jesus got lost in the temple. Well, actually, he intended to be there. So it was his intention to do that. And we'll touch on that momentarily. But first of all, so it would have been a whole day's travel. It's about 84 miles from Jerusalem. Before they would have discovered that he's not with them at all. Then they would have had to gone back a whole day, and then they search in Jerusalem for a whole day, so then that's on the third day they find him. All right, so then they went back, and then that's 3 total days, and they finally find him. When they do find him, they see him in the temple among teachers, and he's making the transition to adulthood just fine. He's with teachers, and he's answering with great understanding. He's given this great intelligent understanding for these teachers, and they're all impressed. Okay, so Mary, of course, like any mother who has lost her child for 2 days, going on 3 days, that third day, who happens to be the Savior of the world, okay, is inflicted with calamity. She's grieving. The great anxiety is what's in the gospel that we read. It translates inflicted with calamity or grieving torment. And of course, in this state, she reproaches Jesus, asking why he's not behaving like an adult. Okay, so he's supposed to be behaving like a responsible adult male, but he obviously did not inform Mary or Joseph or any other relative, friend, etc., that he's going to stay in Jerusalem. He's going to stay in the temple in his father's house. That kind of behavior, again, now here's something else, is that it's a group-oriented culture. So group-oriented cultures, this is sometimes difficult for us to get our head wrapped around because we are very individualistic. Our culture is very individualistic. We're very independent. We're all about ourselves. Me, I do what I want and let everyone follow me, okay? So, or as it is, you can follow someone else. But in a group-oriented culture, such independent and individualistic behavior is irresponsible, it's disrespectful, and is considered to be shameful. All right, so all of that is involved here. So then what does Jesus do? He replies, he's less than respectful reproach of Mary and Joseph is also understandable, as male maturity in the Mediterranean world entails becoming liberated from the female control that characterizes early childhood. So struggling now to trade his mother's tutelage for Joseph's, Jesus is somewhat irritated by their reproach. Okay, now what you're dealing with here is the Son of God who knows who he is, he knows what he's supposed to be doing, and he immediately is right about the Father's work. He is about his Father's work all the time, 100%. Once he figures out who he is, he knows who he's supposed to be, and he's all about that work. And he could have said, hey, Ma, I made you, okay? Joseph, I made you. Okay, this is the Son of God that you're talking to. So the whole point there is that he is the higher authority, and he's a little, now again, in the backdrop of the culture, he's a little irritated. Was he really irritated by his mother's approach? Was he really giving attitude to Mary and Joseph? We don't really know. I don't really know those things, okay? He's the Son of God. He probably responded in kind, but against the cultural backdrop, you know, he's a 12-year-old who's making a transition to adulthood. And so his reproach of Joseph also likely stems from the fact that Jesus believes that maybe Joseph should have been more aggressive instead of passive in assisting Jesus in coming into his role as an adult and taking his place among the all-male group. So what's the point here? What's our application for us? This is you probably haven't heard that whole interpretation, but understanding it against that backdrop starts to make more sense. The whole point about this gospel, though, is that it leads to the Son of God becoming obedient to his lawful authority, even though he doesn't have to. So even though he knows who he is, he's the Son of God, he went down to Nazareth with his parents and was obedient to them. All right, and so this is a very important point for families, for culture, for society. When you lament the world and the mess that it's in, we look at what is one of the major causes of that. It's disobedient behavior to lawful authorities. You look at classrooms these days. A lot of teachers can't control their students. It's unfortunate in a lot of places. Maybe not in Marysville, okay, but a lot of teachers work elsewhere. And so there you have law enforcement that's very much disrespected. You have priests that are very disrespected, and the clergy that's very disrespected. Bishops are disrespected by their priests. Okay, so you have all this opportunity for disobedience to lawful authority. Of course, the church teaching itself. We have all kinds of opportunity to be disobedient, and what happens when people are disobedient? Well, you get this like anarchy, you get this state of nature, if you will, a Hobbesian state of nature. Everything gets messed up, in other words. Okay, Jesus could have started a big argument in his family. That's the point, but he doesn't. Okay, he knows that he's right. I'm about my Father's business. What do you want, Ma? Okay, right? And he could have done that, but he didn't. He chose to be obedient to his lawful authority, who's his parents. I'm in my culture. I know who I am. I'm also an adolescent making transition to adulthood. Sure, Mom, whatever you say. Let's go. Let's go back to Nazareth. All right, so he chooses to be obedient, which leads to what? Well, peace in the family, and of course, order in the family, and also gains honor. Well, in being obedient, he also did something else, ironically, or coincidentally, if you will, is that he fulfilled the fourth commandment, which is also honor your father and mother, which is also fulfilling the Father's will, his real Father. So in being obedient, he fulfills God's will. This is what we need to grab onto, all right? We look at a priest might look at the archbishop and go, I don't understand why we're doing this. I don't understand why you made a decision. I don't understand why we're going in this direction. And then people might look at the priest and go, why is the parish going in this direction? And we look at our government and go, why is the president going in this direction? And why is the principal taking the school in this direction? Why is the superintendent doing, you pick your place. Anywhere in the world, we can sit back and armchair evaluate decisions we have had almost no discussions with, no part in the discussions leading up to those decisions. If we're not involved in every single discussion leading up to a decision, we have no idea why a course of action has been chosen. But yet we judge it, yet we evaluate it, and it leads to disobedience. A disobedient mindset will lead to disobedient behavior eventually, if not resentment right away. What's wrong with the world? Look in the mirror. We're all guilty. Okay, this is the extreme point, which is a simple point, but it's very applicable to our culture. Obedience gains us something. Even if we think we have a better idea, even if we think we know better, even if we are actually right, obedience to a lawful authority does gain a peaceful society. We may not understand it right now, but obedience does gain us understanding in the long run too. Because if my behavior is obedient to, say, church's teachings, eventually I'm going to understand why it is that way. We may not, again, we don't make all these connections, like the whole connection between repentance and joy. Who would put those together? John the Baptist figured it out, of course, all right, and he told everybody that. But for us, here we are in a culture that we continue to lament the problems with. But we also have to take note that the Son of God went down to Nazareth and was obedient to his parents.